Well, talking about the juggling act, with me on the couch today is a woman who wears so many hats she must need a whole cupboard at home to keep them all in shape. Her name is Yolanda Busby Methvin. She's a social entrepreneur, a wife and mom, a freelance TV producer, CEO of her own business called LithaFlora African Botanicals. She's got a very keen interest in social innovation and cultural diversity and all of this reflected in her bi-monthly travel and lifestyle podcast called Be There, Do That. Yolanda, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pippa. It's fantastic to be here.
I want to focus mostly on the podcast, but just before we get to that, a little bit about your own backstory, as the listeners will probably pick up in the accent there. You're from the US originally. What brought you to Cape Town?
I first came to Cape Town in 1992, just on the heels of Chris Hani's assassination, and that had me in South Africa working at Bop TV as a producer on the show that some would remember, Panorama.
Yeah.
So I really fell in love with the country and mostly the people and the opportunity for transformational change. And so in 1998, escaping our own horrors in America, the Bush years, decided to make a go of it and come and stay. I've been here since, longest city I've lived in my life.
So 1998, so yeah, that's over 20 years. It must give you quite a unique perspective on our city and on our problems in South Africa, because by now you kind of have the lens of the outsider looking in, but also, and you've been here long enough to have the insider looking around perspective.
Yeah, that's what my kids say anyway, because they were both born here. Okay. They often say to me, Mom, no one thinks like that. No one says those things. No one understands those concepts because they are South African and I'm American, which I often say now. I'm African-American by birth, but South African and African by choice. So yeah, I can see both sides of the stories often, which lends itself to seeing and seizing opportunities.
And telling stories from a very unique perspective, which we'll go into in more detail about the podcast shortly. But I know that your company that I've mentioned is one of several that you founded, but LithaFlora African Botanicals, I believe, actually grew out of a community education project. Tell us a bit more.
Well, actually, LithaFlora really grew out of my sort of taking, as you just talked about before your commercial break, my kids to and from school. And I said, there's so many things that are coming and growing specifically from the earth, and I realized that unless you're taking a trip over the mountains for some sort of holiday, often people don't really value or interact with indigenous health and wellness traditions any longer. So what I wanted to do was to take indigenous wellness products, those being herbs, pressed leaf oils, and juices, salts from the Karoo, salt pans, and infuse those with indigenous herbs and flowers in order to give a fresh take on something that is deeply traditional and inherent culturally.
And what kind of products does the range include? What do you make from those?
So LithaFlora itself is a five senses journey looking at those things. So it's a taste, touch, smell, and sight, looking at those through the products. So over the years, since I started the business in 2013, it's been cleansing bars, as I mentioned before, desert salt pan solar salts for body bath salts, pressed leaf juices such as bulbine frutescens for sun care, baby bum care, and then herbal teas or tisanes. Those are just sort of dried herbs of concoctions that you may remember from what your grandmother made for you when your throat was aching, and you are able to have now.
I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that I'm hearing somebody with an American accent speaking about this rich indigenous heritage, and that it took someone from outside to spot this and turn it into a business. How do you find you're received in the business world, given that you might be viewed by some as an outsider coming here with traditional South African products?
It's interesting that you've asked that, because funny enough, which is what got me to this podcast expression in the business, in the Western Cape, within the Afrikaans community on the farm, I think people, as a black person, people are very interested in what I have to say and what I'm interested in particular as it relates to African indigenous herbs. Somehow I think it offers them a bridge. So within the farm community, where I've done an enormous amount of sourcing of product for my business and products, primarily within the Afrikaans community, I've been extremely well received, and the suppliers have been exceptionally helpful and generous. Within a face-to-face community, the African local community which for me is everybody, but specifically Black Africans, really understand and appreciate that this is a place of interest for me because I am a reflection of the diaspora. So, there again, it's just been a kind of an all-around, wow, thanks for the acknowledgement. I think often, and I feel comfortable saying this after being here for 21 years, Americans are generally often looked at as, oh, here you go, what are you wanting and how are you saying and what are you thinking you're going to bring new and different. And for me, the interest really has been in actually taking on a journey of being here and learning and integrating from ancient wisdom traditions. There's nothing for me to bring that's new and different, but to actually recycle and repackage in a way that is a little bit more accessible on the basis of my being, as you said, from the outside and the inside. And all of that has sort of got me into the direction of constructing the podcast, which is for the final taste sense within the business range, because it's actually a marketing tool to promote an indigenous snack-based product. Good thing you asked me to come for your lunch show, because I brought a snack for you.
I'm so grateful because I didn't have time to have lunch today, so it's very well timed. Thank you. Trust rusks made with ancient grains and real buttermilk. So where do I'm looking forward to trying it. Yolanda, where do listeners get hold of these products?
Okay, so the podcast actually is a marketing tool to promote what I've developed as a peer-to-peer direct sales model. So this is not, as my other products have been sold through retail outlets that are primarily tourist-driven, this is not a retail-based product. This is to generate youth-based wealth by selling peer-to-peer. So it's not a pyramid, but it's very much, if anyone is familiar with an American Girl Scouts cookie model, it's a way for young people, and in a South African context, that's, high school through 35 years old, to generate sales and monies for themselves at first. The ubiquity of a rusk in a South African context surpasses race, class, language, and location.
Everybody loves
loves a rusk. And for me, the social value of trust is extremely important. And so in creating a trial marketplace within a high school, locally, Cedar House School, and then with a tertiary school in business administration, it was important to come to a set of values that promote what it is that we're doing toward achieving this peer-to-peer sales model. So that's how we named the product Trust Rusks.
I mean, I love that statement that the social value of trust is so important. I mean, it's something that we are still so struggling with in South Africa to overcome decades and generations of mistrust of anybody who doesn't look like us or sound like us or go to the same church of us. We have been groomed for so many generations to mistrust the other. I love to hear your thoughts on breaking down that mistrust and finding a new way towards each other and learning to trust one another.
Well, I think for myself, I just decided to just transfer the television producing skills into an audio format in order to break that down, because in actual fact, food crosses all of those boundaries as well as upholds a lot of those old paradigms. So for me, with the podcast, which is again called Be There, Do That, it's featuring everyday conversations about food, race, and social impact in Africa. So the idea there is that when you and I are talking about rusks and we're eating rusks, you've got a very particular tradition in your family that can go back for as long as you can recall, grandmother, grandmother's grandmother, extended family tradition that speaks to you specifically, what kind of rusk, where, when rusks, and then somebody else has something the same. But what's uniting, no matter what we look like and what language we're speaking, is the fact that it's still a rusk and we are understanding it's food. So that for me is really important because it gives a safe space for people to talk about their differences, to look to the future for a future positive African context around food, and in a food security landscape that's becoming more and more sensitive. It's also really important that everyone, again, no matter who you are and what you look like, understand that unless we start really valuing indigenous grain and what our indigenous plants and what traditional wisdom has to offer in that regard, we're going to have a lot of problems around just eating, no matter what we look like.
I'm so glad you've mentioned that, because you pick up very neatly on a guest we had in late last year who is a PhD student busy studying the indigenous grains from precisely this lens. What can we tap into here as an answer to our food security crisis? Because they are plants that are uniquely adapted to our environment, to our climate. They're hardy, they can resist the heat, the drought, etc. And saying, why isn't anybody using this? This used to be a food source. It fell out of popularity somewhere along the way as we moved to cities and changed what we thought about what constitutes good food. And she's sort of standing in her corner from a PhD student's perspective, shouting out, going, why is not more attention being poured into this and more research being poured into this as an answer? So it's wonderful to hear the business person coming at the same concept from a different angle. So tell us more about the things you talk about on the podcast. For somebody who's never listened to an episode of Be There, Do That, what will they expect to hear?
I would love for you to be able to pass this on to that PhD candidate, because in fact there are so many more people than one would expect who are working directly within this arena. So quite specifically on the podcast, what I do is offer the voice for others to tell these everyday stories. A recent favorite episode of mine is looking specifically at social justice and ancient grains, and that's featuring cultural anthropologist, nutritionist, and an urban cities cultural researcher. So it's Gareth Haysom from the UCT Center Food Security, and I'm forgetting the name of that department, excuse me there, Gareth. Tracy Ledger, author of An Empty Plate, and Mpo Chikuda, who also has written about indigenous ancient grains in her book most recently called Eat Ting. So specifically with my product, and to tie that together, we have used what a lot of people would know as sorghum, which is also called ting, which also people eat just as recently as this morning as amabele, and people drank as recently as last night with mkomboti. So it's used, and it's all over the place, and I've used it in rusk. So there again, as a central point of focus, it's food that speaks to everyone. So the podcast has conversations that engage at that level. And then for me, because I'm really enjoying this continued journey of learning, culinary learning, social impact learning, it's really exciting to hear where people are using these indigenous foods as a lens to create social impact. So if you listen to the podcast, Be There, Do That, you'll hear stories along those lines. And when it's said food, race, and social impact, we are speaking, like, for example, in an episode with a Nigerian food activist who left Lagos, arrived in America, undocumented, has lived there for 25 years as part of the reverse diaspora at this point, cannot go back home because he doesn't have documentation, but is doing extraordinary things in food activism within an African context in America. Wow. Yeah, so it's just the scope is so broad to look at, again, future positive stories as opposed to rehashing old painful tales of separation. It's a real opportunity to bring things and people together through this kind of storytelling around food.
How long does it take you to create an episode? I think I mentioned bi-monthly, so you're getting out two or so a month. Is it a full-time job for you getting each episode made?
No, it's not full-time because it's been self-funded through my business. Okay. And in fact, that's what we are eagerly seeking. I've got an angel investor, and we're looking for enterprise development opportunities where corporates may say, hey, we'd like to happily take those, I won't name a retailer, but those rusks out of our tea ladies' hands and use rather trust rusks. So I produce the podcast really on a 1 monthly basis. We just completed the first season. We are working toward 2 a month. And it takes me about 5 hours in full to complete a 25-minute episode.
Okay, now the final question is where our listeners can listen to those episodes.
Well, it's Be There, Do That. So it's a play on my maiden surname, Busby, like a bumblebee. And also bees provide us with the best of the food security that we're ever going to get. Be There, Do That. It's on iTunes. If you don't choose to use app-based players, it's also on SoundCloud, which you can get online. And then, again, continuing the play on words, buzzsprout.com. Be There, Do That at buzzsprout.com.
And you've been listening to Yolanda Busby Methvin, a social entrepreneur, founder of LithaFlora African Botanicals, and host of the podcast series Be There, Do That. It's been a delight having you with us in studio. I am going to send this podcast on to that PhD student, and I hope anyone listening who wants to connect with you will drop me a line, and I'll gladly pass them on to you, Yolanda.
I so appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Lovely to have you with us in studio today.
Yeah, you too. And enjoy the rusks with your tea.
Can't wait. Have to get a cup of tea in the next news break. Thank you so much.